original story narrated exclusively for Love Written in Silence. A gallery filled with 30 guests. Helena Sinclair stands before a painting no one in this room has seen in 60 years, her hands trembling against the velvet drape that still conceals it. 6 weeks ago, she stood in a ballroom and told a stranger he was wrong. 40 minutes of fearless argument about Caravaggio and light, and whether beauty requires a signature. And when her mother whispered his name, when she learned he was the Duke of Blackmere, the ease between them shattered like glass. 3 days later, his letter arrived at her rented studio, offering a commission that would save her family, and demanding the one thing she has never been allowed to keep: her name on the work itself. Now she must unveil the truth she discovered beneath layers of varnish and deception, a portrait of a woman erased for the same defiant brilliance Helena possesses. And the man she insulted sits 10 feet away, silent, watching her prove herself without his protection. The gallery at Blackmere House held the kind of light painters spent lifetimes chasing: northern exposure, high windows. The afternoon sun filtered through glass that had been cleaned that morning until it disappeared, leaving only illumination and the faint smell of lemon oil on wood. 30 guests stood in a half-circle behind Helena Sinclair, their silk and wool and carefully arranged curiosity filling the space between the paintings and the door. She could feel their eyes on her back. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her ribs. Her hands rested on the velvet drape that covered the painting. Beneath the fabric, beneath 60 years of deliberate concealment, was a woman in a blue dress, a woman whose work had been attributed to a man, a woman whose portrait had been painted over because she refused to be silent. Helena's fingers tightened on the drape. She did not look at the man seated near the window. She did not need to. She knew exactly where Sebastian Carlyle was sitting. She knew the angle of his shoulders, and the stillness of his hands, and the way he had not spoken a single word since the guests began to arrive. 6 weeks ago, she had not known his name. 6 weeks ago, she had told him he was wrong about Caravaggio, about floor tiles, about whether beauty required a signature to matter. She had argued with him for 40 minutes in a ballroom where she did not belong, where her mother had been invited as scenery, as an example of genteel decline for the daughters of men who still had money. Helena had paused before a misattributed painting, and a stranger's voice had interrupted her thoughts. Admiring the dehooch, she had turned. A man, perhaps 30, dark hair and darker eyes, the kind of face that suggested he had spent his entire life being looked at, and had learned to find it tiresome. His evening clothes were perfect. His posture was perfect. His smile was the smile of a man who expected to be agreed with. "It's not a dehooch," Helena had said. His eyebrow lifted. The catalog is wrong." She turned back to the painting. "The light is wrong. Dehooch's interiors have a warmth, a diffusion. This is harder, sharper. Someone influenced by him, certainly, but not the man himself." Silence. Then, with a note of something that might have been amusement, "You're certain? I've spent 4 years authenticating paintings for dealers who sell my work as their own." "Yes, I'm certain." He stepped closer. She felt the shift in proximity, the way the air changed when someone moved into the space beside you, rather than remaining at a polite distance. "Then who painted it?" "I don't know. But I know who didn't." "That seems a rather negative form of expertise." "It's the only honest form." She glanced at him. "Knowing what something isn't is harder than pretending you know what it is." His smile changed. It became real. "I think you've just described most of London society." "I wasn't talking about society. Neither was I." And so it had begun. 40 minutes. They moved from the misattributed dehooch to a Caravaggio in the next room, and from Caravaggio to the question of whether light could lie, and from light to the entire philosophy of attribution. He argued that beauty required context, lineage, a name to give it meaning. She argued that beauty existed whether or not anyone acknowledged it, that a painting's power had nothing to do with the signature in the corner. He was sharp. He was relentless. He smiled every time she refused to yield. She forgot entirely that she was supposed to be invisible. And then her mother's hand touched her arm. Margaret Sinclair's face was pale, her voice barely a whisper. "Helena, that is the Duke of Blackmere." The ease died. Helena felt it go out of her like air from a punctured lung. She turned back to the man who was not a stranger, who was a duke, who was the kind of person her mother had taught her never to address without invitation. His expression had not changed. He was still watching her, still waiting for her reply to whatever point he had just made about Venetian light. She could not remember the point. "We were discussing nothing of consequence, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were shaking. "Forgive the intrusion on your evening." She turned and walked away. She did not look back. Her mother followed, silent and stricken, and they left the ball 20 minutes later with polite excuses and the kind of humiliation that sat in your chest like a stone. 3 days later, the letter arrived. Helena had been working in her studio in Holborn, a rented room above a bookbinder's shop that smelled of leather and ink, and the linseed oil she used to clean her brushes. The letter was on heavy paper, sealed with a crest she recognized from the scandal sheets her sister Charlotte liked to read. The Duke of Blackmere requested her services to restore his family's collection. The fee was listed in precise, generous terms. It would clear her late father's debts. It would pay Charlotte's school fees for 2 years. It would secure the lease on the townhouse where her mother still lived, surrounded by the furniture they had not yet sold. Helena read the letter 3 times. Then she wrote a reply, professional, brief, accepting the commission with the same detachment she would offer any client. She did not mention the ball. She did not apologize. She signed her name and sent the letter before she could reconsider. When she arrived at Blackmere House the following week, the butler led her through corridors that seemed designed to remind visitors of their own insignificance. The gallery, when they finally reached it, was magnificent. Paintings floor to ceiling, generations of collected work, the kind of room her father would have spent days examining. The light was extraordinary. Sebastian Carlyle was waiting beside the largest canvas, a landscape darkened by decades of smoke and varnish. He turned when she entered. His face was perfectly composed, his greeting perfectly courteous. "Miss Sinclair, thank you for coming, Your Grace." She set down her case. "I've reviewed the inventory you sent. I'll need to examine each piece individually before I can provide a timeline, of course, and I'll require access to the works at specific times of day. The light changes the way pigment appears. Whatever you need." His tone was formal. Hers was excessively professional. Neither mentioned the ball. Neither mentioned Caravaggio or floor tiles or the 40 minutes they had spent arguing like equals. Helena began her examination. Sebastian remained in the gallery, ostensibly reviewing correspondence, but she could feel his attention even when his eyes were on the page. The first week passed in near silence. The second week, he began asking questions, small ones at first. Why she was testing the varnish in that particular corner, what the discoloration along the frame suggested about storage conditions. She answered, because the questions were genuine, because he listened to her replies with the same attention he had given her at the ball, before she knew who he was. By the third week, the masks had begun to slip. He brought her tea without asking, setting the cup on the table beside her brushes. She explained the chemistry of pigment degradation, the way certain colors faded while others intensified. The detective work required to see what a painting had been before time and carelessness obscured it. He listened. He asked better questions. She almost forgot his rank. Almost. But the contract was signed. The fee was essential. Her family's survival depended on this work, and on her ability to complete it without antagonizing the man who held their future in his perfectly composed hands. So she worked, and he watched, and the gallery filled day by day with something neither of them named. The weeks folded into each other, measured in the slow transformation of canvas and light. Helena arrived each morning at 9, when the sun slanted through the eastern windows and turned the gallery into a cathedral of illumination. She worked in silence, her hands steady, her focus absolute. The paintings revealed themselves layer by layer, a century of smoke lifting under her careful solvents, colors emerging like secrets, finally allowed to breathe. Sebastian visited daily. At first he claimed inspection, walking the perimeter of the gallery with his hands behind his back, pausing to examine her progress with the detached interest of a patron reviewing an investment. But by the second week, the pretense had thinned. He began arriving with questions about pigment composition, about the way she identified overpainting, about whether it was possible to restore something without erasing the marks time had left on it. "You're asking whether restoration is a form of lying," Helena said one afternoon, not looking up from the canvas she was cleaning. A pastoral scene, sheep and hills, and a sky that had been brown with varnish, and was now, inch by revealed inch, becoming blue again. "I'm asking whether it's possible to return something to what it was, or whether we're only ever creating what we imagine it should have been." She paused, set down her brush, turned to face him. He was standing by the window, the light catching the angles of his face, and for a moment she forgot to be careful. "We're revealing what the artist intended. The varnish, the smoke, the overpainting by later hands, those are the lies. Removing them is the closest we can come to truth. And if the truth is disappointing, then at least it's honest." His mouth curved. Not the social smile, the practiced one. The real smile, the one that made him look younger and sad and entirely human. "You have a remarkable faith in honesty, Miss Sinclair. It's the only thing I've ever been good at." Something shifted in his expression. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sudden, unsettling sense that he was seeing past the professional detachment she wore like armor, past the careful deference she maintained because he was a duke, and she was a woman who restored paintings for money. Then he turned back to the window. "I'll leave you to your work." But he did not leave. He sat in the chair near the door, the one with the worn velvet seat that suggested it had been placed there long ago for someone who liked to watch the light move across the walls. He opened a book. He did not read it. Helena returned to her canvas and pretended not to notice. The quiet between them held a peculiar weight. Lady Constance Drummond arrived on a Tuesday, sweeping into the gallery with the kind of entrance that suggested she expected applause. She was Sebastian's aunt, 54, handsome in the way of women who had been beautiful once and refused to acknowledge the past tense. Her gaze moved over Helena with the brief, dismissive assessment reserved for servants and tradespeople. "Sebastian, darling, I had no idea you were undertaking such an ambitious project." She crossed to the nearest painting, a portrait Helena had finished the previous week. "How lovely. One can hardly tell it's been touched." "That's the intention," Helena said. Constance turned. Her smile was cool. "Of course, you must be the restorer. How industrious." Sebastian's voice was perfectly even. "Miss Sinclair has been working on the collection for nearly a month. The results have been exceptional, I'm sure." Constance's attention drifted back to the portrait. "Though I do hope you're planning to have the work reviewed before any public exhibition. The Royal Academy has such strict standards for authentication. It would be dreadful if any questions arose about provenance." Helena's hand stilled on the canvas. She did not look up. She did not need to. The threat was clear. Not gossip, not whispers, institutional dismissal. The suggestion that her work required a man's approval before it could be trusted. "Miss Sinclair's credentials are impeccable," Sebastian said. His tone had not changed, but something beneath it had gone cold. "Her late father was one of the most respected authenticators in England. She trained under him for 8 years. How charming, a family trade." Constance adjusted her gloves. "Still, I'm sure you understand the necessity of proper verification. For the collection's sake." She left 20 minutes later, trailing perfume and the faint, poisonous residue of doubt. Helena continued working. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was tight. Sebastian remained in his chair. He did not speak. The quiet stretched until it became unbearable, and finally Helena set down her brush and turned to face him. "You don't need to defend me. I wasn't defending you. I was stating a fact. She's your family. That doesn't make her correct." Helena picked up a clean cloth, folding it with unnecessary precision. "She's going to push for the Academy review. You know that. Let her. And if they dismiss my work, if they require a man's signature before your collection can be exhibited." He stood, crossed the gallery to where she stood beside the easel. He did not touch her, but he was close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the tension in his jaw. "Then they will be wrong, and we will prove it." "We? Did you think I was going to stand aside and let them question your expertise. I think you're a duke, and I think institutional power doesn't care about expertise when there's a woman holding the brush. His expression shifted. Something in it softened, and for a moment he looked almost uncertain. Do you want me to withdraw the commission? If this is going to damage your reputation? No. The word came out sharper than she intended. I need this work. My family needs this work. I'm not walking away because your aunt doesn't believe women should be trusted with valuable paintings. Then we continue. And when the Academy sends their reviewer, then you show them the same thing you've shown me. The truth in every brushstroke. He returned to his chair. Helena returned to her canvas. But the air between them had changed again, charged with something neither of them was ready to name. That evening, as the light began to fail and Helena prepared to leave, she noticed a small pen and ink drawing tucked into the corner of a cabinet. A caricature, skillfully done, labeled in a careless hand. The insufferable Duke. The figure was unmistakably Sebastian. Same dark hair, same aristocratic nose, but drawn with obvious affection. The kind of teasing that only came from love. She pulled it free, turned. Sebastian was still in his chair, watching her. Who drew this? His face changed. The mask he wore so carefully cracked, just for a moment, and she saw the grief beneath it. Raw, unhealed. My brother, Edmund. His voice was quiet. He died 3 years ago. Helena looked down at the drawing. The ink was fading, the paper soft with age. He was talented. He was insufferable. A pause. He was the only person who ever told me the truth. She set the drawing back in the cabinet. Handling it with the same care she gave to paintings worth thousands of pounds. When she looked up, Sebastian was watching her with an expression she could not read. I'm sorry, she said. He nodded. Did not speak. What followed was the kind of quiet that understood some griefs could not be answered with words. Helena left the gallery as the last light drained from the sky. Behind her, Sebastian remained in his chair, alone with his brother's drawing, and the painting slowly returning to life, under a stranger's hands. The discovery came in the 5th week, on a morning when the gallery was filled with the kind of light that made colors sing. Helena was working on a landscape, a sweeping view of hills and sky that had been damaged by water at some point in its history. The canvas had buckled, the paint cracked and lifting in places. She had been stabilizing it for days, carefully readhering the paint layer, when she noticed something odd about the stretcher frame. Scratches, deliberate ones, a series of marks along the inner edge of the wood, hidden from view unless you removed the canvas entirely. Her hand stilled. She knew those marks. She had seen them 100 times in her father's workshop, on paintings he had authenticated over decades of work. Nathaniel Sinclair's cipher, his private mark scratched into the wood where only another expert would think to look. This was her father's work. She stood abruptly, crossing to the next painting she had restored. A still life, fruit and flowers arranged with mathematical precision. She lifted it from the wall, turned it over. There, on the stretcher frame, hidden beneath decades of dust, the same marks. 2 paintings, both her father's authentication, both in Sebastian's collection. Helena's chest felt tight. She set the still life down with shaking hands and returned to the landscape. She had restored this piece without knowing it carried her father's mark. She had seen through the damage and the dirt to the artist's original intention, had understood the composition, instinctively had known exactly how to bring it back to life, because she recognized her father's hand, because she had watched him work on pieces exactly like this, had learned to see the way he saw. The door opened. Sebastian entered, carrying the same leather-bound book he never seemed to read. He took one look at her face and stopped. What's wrong? She gestured to the painting. This is my father's work, and the still life. He authenticated both of them. His cipher is on the stretcher frames. Sebastian crossed to the landscape, examining the marks she indicated. His expression was unreadable. You didn't know. And her voice sounded strange to her own ears. I've been restoring my father's paintings for 5 weeks, and I didn't know until now. Does it matter? Of course it matters. She pressed her hands flat against the work table, kneading the solidity of wood beneath her palms. My best work on these canvases, it came so easily. I thought it was because I understood the artist's technique. But what if it was just recognition? What if I'm not seeing what's there? I'm seeing what my father taught me to see. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, or perhaps you're seeing what's there because he taught you how to look. Those aren't the same thing, aren't they? No, he moved closer, not touching her, but near enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool gallery air. Your father taught you the technique, the chemistry, the history, how to identify pigments and understand light. But what you do with that knowledge, the way you see through damage to the truth beneath it, that's yours. He gave you the tools. You're the one using them. Helena wanted to believe him. But the doubt had taken root, cold and insidious, wrapping around her certainty, like varnish obscuring paint. How did you acquire these paintings? They were purchased at auction 4 years ago. I can have the records pulled if you... 4 years ago. The same year my father died. She looked up at him. The same year, his collection was sold to pay his debts. Understanding moved across his face. You think these were his? I don't know, but I'd like to find out. He nodded. I'll send for the provenance documentation this afternoon. The records arrived 2 days later. Helena read them in the small sitting room Sebastian had given her for breaks, a space with good light and a view of the gardens. The paintings had been purchased at auction by an intermediary buyer. The seller was listed as the Sinclair estate. The price paid was a fraction of their actual value. The intermediary buyer's name was listed in the final line of the documentation. Lady Constance Drummond. Helena set down the papers. Her hands were very steady. Everything inside her had gone cold and clear and absolutely certain. Sebastian found her an hour later, still sitting with the documents spread across the low table. He looked at the name, looked at her face. I didn't know, he said quietly. I believe you. I can return them. If you want your father's work back. No. She stood, gathering the papers with precise movements. I don't want charity. I want my father's name on the provenance. And I want to finish the restoration. Helena, she bought these knowing exactly what they were worth. She paid almost nothing for them. And now she's trying to force me out before I can prove my work is as good as his. Helena looked at him directly, her chin lifted. I won't give her the satisfaction. His expression shifted into something fierce and proud. Let me make sure she doesn't get it. But that night, alone in her studio in Holborn, Helena stared at the canvas she had been working on, a piece that had nothing to do with Sebastian's commission. A small landscape she was restoring for a dealer who would sell it under his own authentication. Her hands moved through the familiar motions. Solvent cloth, the careful removal of decades of grime, and all she could think was, how much of this is mine? How much of what I see is only what he taught me to see? The question followed her into sleep and waited for her when she woke. The hidden portrait emerged on a Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks into the commission. Helena had been working on a damaged landscape, a pastoral scene that had suffered water damage along one edge. The varnish had darkened unevenly, and beneath it the paint had begun to lift. She had been removing the degraded varnish layer by layer, working with the methodical patience the task required, when her solvent-dampened cloth revealed something unexpected. Blue, a vivid, luminous blue that had nothing to do with the sky in the pastoral scene. She stopped, leaned closer. The blue was beneath the landscape, a different painting entirely, deliberately covered. She had seen this before, artists reusing canvases, painting over earlier works to save the cost of new materials. But this felt different. The landscape above was competent but unremarkable. The blue beneath it sang. Helena sat back, her mind racing through possibilities. She would need to test the paint layers, determine whether removing the upper painting would damage what lay beneath. She would need Sebastian's permission to proceed. This could take weeks. She found him in the library, reading correspondence with the same focused attention he gave to everything. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression made him set down the letter. There's another painting, she said. Beneath the landscape I've been restoring. It was deliberately covered. He stood. Show me. In the gallery, she indicated the patch of blue she had revealed. I'll need to do more tests, but I believe the underlying work is significantly older than the landscape, and possibly more valuable. Can you uncover it without destroying the landscape? The landscape isn't worth saving. The technique is mediocre, the composition derivative. Whoever painted it was copying better work. She touched the edge of the blue with careful fingers. But this is something else. Then uncover it. The work took 3 weeks. Helena proceeded with exquisite caution, removing the landscape layer by layer, documenting every stage. The blue resolved into fabric, a dress richly painted, the kind of work that suggested an artist who understood how light moved across silk. Then a hand, pale against the blue, holding something Helena couldn't yet discern. Then a face, a woman, perhaps 40, with dark hair and direct eyes, and an expression of absolute composure. In her hand, a botanical illustration, a spray of leaves and flowers, rendered with scientific precision. Helena stepped back. The portrait was nearly complete now, the woman emerging from beneath a century of concealment, like a secret finally allowed to speak. The technique was masterful, the presence undeniable, and in the bottom corner, barely visible, a signature, E. Carlyle. Sebastian had been visiting the gallery daily to check her progress. When he arrived that afternoon and saw the portrait, he went very still. "Do you know who she is?" Helena asked. "My grandmother, Lady Eleanor Carlyle." His voice was quiet. "I've never seen this portrait. I didn't know it existed." Helena gestured to the botanical illustration in the painted woman's hand. Was she an artist? A botanical illustrator? She published 3 volumes of British flora before she married my grandfather. He moved closer to the portrait, studying it with an intensity Helena recognized, the look of someone seeing a family member they had only known through stories. After the marriage, her work continued to appear in scientific journals, but it was attributed to a colleague, a man. She let them take credit for her work. She didn't let them. They took it anyway. When she protested, when she tried to publish under her own name again, my grandfather made it clear that the choice was between her work and her reputation. She chose her work. He had her portrait painted over. The words fell into the quiet gallery like stones into still water. Helena looked at the woman in the blue dress, at the direct gaze, and the botanical illustration, held like a declaration, and felt something crack open in her chest. She was erased, Helena said, for the same thing I've been doubting in myself. Sebastian turned to her. What do you mean? The words came before she could stop them. When I found my father's cipher on those paintings, when I realized I'd been restoring his work without knowing it, I started to doubt whether my skill was real, whether I was seeing what was there, or just recognizing what he taught me. But this, she gestured to the portrait. Her skill was real. Her work was real. They took credit for it because it was inconvenient for her to be talented. The doubt was never about whether she was good enough. It was about a world that couldn't allow her to be. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. And you think that's what happened to you? I think I've spent 4 years working for men who sell my authentications under their names. I think I came to your house expecting you to dismiss me the way everyone else has. And I think when I found my father's mark on those paintings, I convinced myself that everything I am is just an echo of him. She looked at the portrait, at Lady Eleanor's steady gaze. But she's proof that the doubt is the lie, not the talent. Yes, Sebastian said quietly. She is. What followed was different from the quiet that had come before. Helena felt the weight of it, the way it seemed to hold all the things neither of them had said over 6 weeks of working side by side in this gallery. Finally, Sebastian spoke. I want to show this, publicly. Helena's breath caught. Your aunt will fight you. This portrait is evidence that your family erased a woman for refusing to be silent. I know. It will raise questions about the entire collection, about what else might have been hidden. I know. He turned to her. But you're right. The talent was real. The work was real. And it's been hidden long enough. That evening, as the light began to fail, Helena remained in the gallery. She stood before Lady Eleanor's portrait, studying the botanical illustration in the painted woman's hand. The detail was extraordinary, every vein in every leaf rendered with scientific precision and artistic grace. She heard footsteps behind her. Sebastian, returning to the gallery, though the hour was late. I've been thinking about what you said, he began, about testing people, about the ball. Helena turned. He was standing in the doorway, backlit by the corridor lamps, his face in shadow. After Edmund died, I started testing everyone who came near me, provoking them, pushing to see if they would push back or simply agree. 3 years of conversations, where every word was calculated to separate the honest from the convenient. He stepped into the gallery. And then you told me I was wrong about Caravaggio. You argued with me for 40 minutes about floor tiles and light, and whether beauty needed a signature. You didn't know who I was, so you had no reason to perform. You were just yourself. And then I found out you were a duke and I ran. You had every reason to. I'd been testing you without your knowledge or consent, using you to satisfy my own need to find someone real. He came closer, his footsteps quiet, on the gallery floor. But here's the truth. I should have told you weeks ago. I wasn't testing you at the ball. I was arguing with you because I was enjoying it. Because you were the first person in 3 years to look at me and see someone worth disagreeing with. And when you walked away, when your face changed, and I realized you thought I'd been playing some kind of game, I wanted to follow you, to tell you it was real, every word of it. Helena's throat felt tight. Why didn't you? Because I didn't know if you'd believe me. And because I was afraid that if I tried to explain, you'd hear it as a duke making excuses instead of a man telling you the truth. She looked at him, really looked, the way she looked at paintings, searching for what lay beneath the surface. She saw the grief he carried, the careful control that was both armor and prison. She saw the man who had sat in this gallery day after day, listening to her explain the chemistry of pigment and the philosophy of restoration, never interrupting, never dismissing. Edmund would have liked you, Sebastian said quietly. He would have called you terrifying and meant it as the highest compliment. You've never told me his name before. Not directly. I know. He was close enough now that she could see his face clearly in the fading light. I haven't said his name to anyone in 3 years. But you've been standing in my gallery for 6 weeks, bringing paintings back to life, uncovering my grandmother's portrait. And I keep thinking, he would have adored watching you work. He would have asked you 1,000 questions and laughed every time you proved me wrong about something. Helena felt the cold doubt of the past weeks begin to thaw under the warmth of this moment. I'm going to show the portrait, with full authentication notes. My name on the provenance, I know. Your aunt will use it against me. She'll say I'm exploiting your family's history. She'll push harder for the Academy review. Let her. His voice was steady. You'll prove her wrong the same way you've proven everything else, through the quality of your work. And if the Academy dismisses me anyway, then we'll find another way. But I don't think they will. He reached out, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his hand near hers. You see truth in paintings that have been hidden for a century. You brought my grandmother back from beneath a layer of lies. You don't need my endorsement. You need the world to see what I've been watching for 6 weeks. That you're extraordinary. She turned her hand, palm up. He laced his fingers through hers. Neither of them spoke. The gallery filled with shadows as the last light died, and they stood together before the portrait of a woman who had refused to be silent, holding on. The Royal Academy's reviewer arrived on a gray morning 3 days before the planned unveiling. Dr. Marcus Thornby, 68, with the kind of face that suggested he had spent a lifetime pronouncing judgment and had learned to enjoy it. Lady Constance had arranged the visit personally, arriving at Blackmere an hour before Thornby to ensure, as she put it, everything was in order for such an important examination. Helena met them in the gallery, her authentication notes prepared, her evidence organized. She had barely slept the night before, running through every possible challenge, every question Thornby might raise. Her father had dealt with Academy reviewers dozens of times. She had watched him present evidence with calm authority, had learned that the key was not to defend, but to demonstrate. She would not defend. She would show the truth and let it speak. Thornby examined the restored paintings first, the works Helena had completed over the past 6 weeks. He studied them with performative skepticism, holding a magnifying lens to the brushwork, questioning her choice of solvents, requesting documentation for every technical decision. Helena answered each question with precision, her voice steady, her hands still. Sebastian sat near the window, ostensibly reading correspondence. He did not look up. He did not intervene. Helena understood why. If he defended her, If he used his authority to silence Thornby's questions, it would confirm exactly what Constance wanted the world to believe: that Helena's work required a duke's endorsement to be credible, that she could not stand on her own expertise. So he sat without speaking, and Helena faced Thornby alone, and the price of that restraint cut deep. "And this," Thornby said, stopping before Lady Eleanor's portrait, "this is the piece Lady Constance mentioned. The supposed discovery." "Not supposed," Helena said quietly. "Documented. I have the full technical analysis here." She handed him the authentication notes. 20 pages of evidence. The paint layer analysis, showing the portrait's age relative to the landscape painted over it. The stylistic comparison with Lady Eleanor's known botanical illustrations. The archival research confirming that Eleanor Carlyle had been a published illustrator whose work was later attributed to a male colleague. Thornby read in silence. Helena waited. Lady Constance stood near the door, her expression carefully neutral, but Helena could see the tension in her shoulders. Finally, Thornby looked up. "The technical analysis is thorough, but you're asking the Academy to accept that a significant portrait was deliberately concealed, and that you, working alone, have both uncovered it and authenticated it. That's an extraordinary claim." "Yes," Helena said. "It is. And you expect us to simply take your word for it?" "No. I expect you to examine the evidence and reach your own conclusion. The evidence you prepared. The evidence the painting itself provides. I'm simply presenting what's there." Constance spoke from the doorway, her voice gentle. "Dr. Thornby, I think what concerns the Academy is the question of independent verification. Miss Sinclair is undoubtedly talented, but for a discovery of this magnitude, surely a second opinion is unnecessary," Helena said. Her voice was still quiet, but something in it had changed. "Unless you're suggesting that my technical analysis is flawed, in which case I invite you to point out the specific errors." A hush fell. Thornby looked at her for a long moment. Then he returned his attention to the authentication notes, reading more slowly this time. Helena waited. She did not look at Sebastian. She did not look at Constance. She kept her eyes on Thornby, and her breathing steady, and her hands loose at her sides. Finally, Thornby set down the notes. "The analysis is sound. The evidence is compelling. I see no reason to question the authentication." Constance's face went very still. "However," Thornby continued, "I will recommend that the Academy send a formal representative to the unveiling. For the record." "Of course," Helena said. Thornby left 20 minutes later. Constance followed shortly after, her goodbye to Sebastian clipped and cold. When the gallery was empty again, when the sound of their footsteps had faded down the corridor, Helena sat down on the nearest chair. Her hands were shaking. Sebastian crossed the room, sat beside her, did not speak. "You didn't defend me," Helena said. "Because if you had, it would have confirmed that I needed defending." "Yes," she looked at him. "That was the hardest thing I've ever watched you do." His jaw was tight. "That was the hardest thing I've ever done. Sitting there, while he questioned your expertise, knowing I could silence him with a word. Choosing not to, because you needed to defeat him yourself." "Thank you. Don't thank me. I hated every second of it." She laughed, a shaky sound that was half relief and half hysteria. "So did I." He reached for her hand. She let him take it. They sat together in the quiet gallery, surrounded by the paintings she had brought back to life. And neither of them let go. That night, Helena worked late in the gallery, preparing the final details for the unveiling. She had decided how to present Lady Eleanor's portrait, centered, alone, with the authentication notes displayed beside it. Not as part of the Carlyle collection, but as its own discovery. A truth that stood independent of the family that had tried to hide it. She was adjusting the lighting when she heard footsteps. Sebastian, entering the gallery, though the hour was well past midnight. "You should be asleep," she said. "So should you." He crossed to where she stood before the portrait. For a long moment, he simply looked at his grandmother's face, at the direct gaze, and the botanical illustration, held like a weapon. "She loved my grandfather," he said quietly. "I found her letters once, in the library. She loved him, even after he had her portrait covered. Even after he let other men take credit for her work. And I think that's the worst part. Not that he erased her, but that she loved him anyway." Helena's throat felt tight. Love doesn't always protect us from the people we give it to. It doesn't. He turned to her. I won't erase you. I won't take credit for your work. And if you ever feel that I'm using you, testing you, asking you to be smaller so I can be comfortable, I need you to walk away. The way you walked away at the ball. Because I never want to be the man who makes you doubt yourself. She set down the cloth she'd been holding, turned to face him fully. I have conditions. I would expect nothing less. My name appears on every authentication, not as your employee, as the expert who did the work. Agreed. My studio remains my own. I don't give up my independence because she hesitated, because of whatever this is between us. Agreed. And if you ever test me again, if you ever provoke me to see whether I'll perform or prove something, I walk out of this room exactly as I walked out of Lady Forsyth's ballroom, and I won't come back. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I have one condition of my own. What? If I fail? If I do something that makes you feel erased or dismissed or smaller? Tell me. Don't just leave. Tell me first. Give me the chance to hear you the way I should have heard you from the beginning. She looked at him. This man who had tested everyone for 3 years, who had built walls out of grief and wit and aristocratic distance, who was standing in front of her, now asking to be held accountable. Then we may continue discussing the floor tiles, she said. His smile was real, unguarded. The smile Edmund must have seen before the accident, before the grief. You were right about the Caravaggio, you know. I know. Insufferable, absolutely. He kissed her then, standing in the gallery surrounded by paintings and lamplight, and the portrait of a woman who had refused to be silent. Helena kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, 3 months of careful distance collapsing into this single moment of absolute honesty. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers. I'm terrified, he said quietly. Of what? That I'll fail you. That I'll become the man my grandfather was. Then don't. She pulled back enough to meet his eyes. You get to choose. Every day. Choose differently. He nodded, drew her back against him. They stood together in the quiet gallery, holding on, while the lamplight flickered, and the portrait watched, and the night deepened around them. The day of the unveiling arrived with cold clarity. The sky was colorless, the kind of blank winter light that made colors seem more vivid by contrast. Helena arrived at Blackmere House at dawn, though the guests would not arrive for hours. She needed to see the gallery empty one more time, needed to stand before Lady Eleanor's portrait, in solitude, before the room, filled with voices and judgment. Sebastian found her there, an hour later. He did not ask why she had come so early. He simply sat in his usual chair and waited with her, while the light changed and the morning grew. At 2 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. 30 of them, collectors, scholars, members of the Royal Academy, titled patrons whose opinions could make or destroy a reputation. Lady Constance came early, positioning herself near the entrance with the practiced ease of someone who knew how to control a room. She greeted each arrival with warm smiles and carefully placed comments about the Carlisle collection, about Sebastian's dedication to preserving his family's heritage, about how lovely it was that he had employed such a meticulous restorer. Helena listened from the far end of the gallery. Meticulous, not brilliant, not expert. Meticulous, like a servant who had cleaned something well. The restored paintings were admired. Guests circulated, examining the work Helena had done over 3 months, commenting on the clarity of color, the way centuries of grime had been lifted to reveal the original beauty beneath. Several collectors paused to read the small plaques Helena had prepared, noting the techniques used, the challenges overcome. Not one plaque bore her name. Sebastian had wanted to include it. Helena had refused. Let the work speak first, she had said. If they ask, I'll tell them. But I won't claim credit before they've decided whether the work deserves it. At 3 o'clock, when the guests had settled into comfortable circulation, Helena stepped forward. The room quieted. She stood before the covered portrait, her hands steady on the velvet drape, and began to speak. 3 months ago, I was asked to restore the Carlisle collection. What I found was more than damaged varnish and degraded pigment. I found evidence of deliberate concealment. Beneath this landscape, she gestured to the frame beside her, where the pastoral scene had been remounted for reference, was another painting entirely. a portrait that had been covered, deliberately, and hidden for more than 60 years. She pulled the drape free. The portrait of Lady Eleanor Carlisle emerged into the light. The blue dress seemed to glow. The woman's direct gaze met the room with unflinching composure. In her hand, the botanical illustration was rendered with such precision that individual leaf veins were visible. The gallery went absolutely silent. Helena continued, her voice steady. "This is Lady Eleanor Carlisle, the third Duke's wife. She was a botanical illustrator who published 3 volumes of British flora before her marriage. After her marriage, her work continued to appear in scientific journals, but it was attributed to a male colleague. When she protested, when she attempted to publish under her own name again, this portrait was painted over." She gestured to the authentication notes displayed beside the portrait. "The evidence is here. Paint layer analysis showing the portrait predates the landscape by at least 40 years. Stylistic comparison with Lady Eleanor's known botanical work, demonstrating consistent technique and subject matter. Archival research confirming her publications and the subsequent attribution to her colleague." A hand raised. Lord Pemberton, a collector whose opinion carried weight. "Who performed this analysis?" "I did. And you are?" "Helena Sinclair. I've been restoring the Carlisle collection for the past 3 months." Another voice, this one belonging to a woman Helena didn't recognize. "What are your credentials?" "I trained under my father, Nathaniel Sinclair, for 8 years. He was an authenticator for the British Museum and the Royal Academy. I've been working independently for 4 years, primarily in restoration and attribution." Dr. Thornby stepped forward. Helena's pulse jumped, but she kept her face composed. "I examined Miss Sinclair's technical analysis 3 days ago, at Lady Constance's request. The methodology is sound. The evidence is compelling. I found no reason to question the authentication." The room shifted. Helena felt it, the way attention crystallized, the way skepticism began to yield to genuine interest. Questions came. Helena answered each one with the precision her father had taught her, citing specific pigment compositions, explaining the process of removing the overlying landscape without damaging the portrait beneath, walking the guests through the archival evidence that confirmed Lady Eleanor's identity and her work. She did not look at Sebastian. She did not need his endorsement. The painting spoke for itself. After 20 minutes, the questions slowed. Guests began to approach the portrait directly, examining the brushwork, the extraordinary detail of the botanical illustration. Helena heard fragments of conversation, remarkable discovery, exceptional technique, can't believe it was hidden. Lady Constance stood near the window, her face composed, but her hands tight on her reticule. She had orchestrated this unveiling, expecting a quiet acknowledgement of the Carlisle collection, a restorer paid and forgotten. Instead, she was watching a woman claim credit for uncovering a truth that indicted Constance's entire worldview. Helena crossed to where Constance stood, kept her voice low. "You bought my father's paintings at auction for a fraction of their value. You knew exactly what they were worth." Constance's expression didn't change. "I purchased them legally. If the seller undervalued them, that's hardly my concern." "You're right. It's not." Helena gestured to the portrait. "But you tried to erase me the same way the third Duke erased her. Institutional dismissal, questioning my credentials, requiring a man's approval before my work could be trusted. And it didn't work, because the evidence stands on its own, just like her talent stood on its own, whether or not your family acknowledged it." Constance looked at the portrait, at the direct gaze and the botanical illustration, and the undeniable proof of a woman's skill. She said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Helena turned and walked back to the center of the gallery. Sebastian was watching her from across the room. He did not smile. He did not cross to her. He simply inclined his head, a small gesture of acknowledgement that held more weight than any public declaration. The unveiling continued for another hour. Guests circulated, asked questions, examined the authentication notes. 3 collectors requested Helena's card for future commissions. Dr. Thornby spent 15 minutes studying the portrait with his magnifying lens, then approached Helena to compliment her technique. When the last guest finally departed, when the gallery emptied and the winter afternoon began to fade. Helena found herself alone with the portrait. She stood before it, feeling the weight of the past 3 months settle into her bones. The doubt, the discovery, the moment she had chosen to trust her own expertise over the world's dismissal. Footsteps behind her. Sebastian, returning to the gallery. "You didn't tell me you were going to show it," he said. "You didn't need to approve it. It's my authentication." "I know." He came to stand beside her. "That's why I said nothing." She turned to him. "Your aunt is going to make this difficult. Let her. She's already lost." Edmund would have liked this, wouldn't he? Watching his family's secrets come to light. He would have adored it. He would have called you terrifying and meant it as the highest compliment. Sebastian's voice dropped, became something private and raw. "I have spent 3 years testing every person who enters a room with me. You are the only one who told me I was wrong. At a ball, about floor tiles. And tonight you stood in my family's gallery and proved that this house erased a woman for the same quality I fell in love with in you." Helena's breath caught. "You didn't speak during the questions. You just sat there, because it was not my truth to tell. It was yours." He turned to face her fully. "And you didn't need me. You needed them to see what I've been watching for 3 months. That you're extraordinary. That your work stands on its own. That you don't require a duke's endorsement to be credible. I was terrified you would intervene. That you would try to defend me and confirm everything Constance believes about women needing men's authority. I know. That's why I stayed silent. Even though watching Thornby question you was the hardest thing I've done since Edmund died." She reached for his hand. He laced his fingers through hers, and they stood together before the portrait of a woman who had been erased and was now, finally, seen. "I have one more condition," Helena said. "Tell me, if we do this, if we choose this, you don't get to protect me from the consequences. I don't want to be sheltered. I want to be your equal in everything." "Agreed." He raised her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her paint-stained knuckles. "Though I reserve the right to be terrified for you." Silently,